The morning sun had barely stretched its golden rays across the small town of Greenville when something happened that would soon have the whole community talking. A quiet street corner, where nothing much usually stirred besides the soft rustling of trees and the occasional neighbor walking their dog, suddenly became the center of a moment no one could ignore. And at the heart of it stood two men from opposite worlds. One, a young man on a roaring motorcycle, and the other, an 85-year-old black man who had simply been walking home with a bag of groceries in his hand. It began like any ordinary day. Mr. Elijah Townsend, known around the neighborhood as Mr. E, was heading back from the market with a gentle smile on his face and a familiar nod for everyone he passed. A retired school janitor and a Korean War veteran, Elijah was the kind of man who never had a bad word for anybody. Always dressed in his brown cap and long coat, he moved a little slower these days, but his spirit was sharp. Folks respected him, not just because of his age, but because of his kindness, his stories, and how he treated everyone like they mattered. On the other side of town, the sound of an engine growled to life. It belonged to a biker named Trent, a man who looked like trouble even before he opened his mouth. Covered in tattoos, heavy boots, and always wearing dark sunglasses, Trent wasn't known for patience or kindness. He rode like the rules didn't apply to him, weaving in and out of traffic, speeding through neighborhoods where kids played, and ignoring stop signs like they were suggestions. But that morning, something had set him off. Maybe it was a bad night, or maybe it was something deeper inside him that had been simmering for a long time. The two men crossed paths at the corner of 8th and Lawrence. Elijah was halfway through the crosswalk when Trent's motorcycle came roaring down the street. He should have stopped. There was a stop sign and Elijah had the right of way. But Trent didn't slow down, he revved his engine louder, as if trying to intimidate the old man. Elijah paused, steady on his cane, and raised a hand, motioning for him to slow down. That small gesture, it was like a spark to dry leaves. Witnesses said it all happened so fast. The bike skidded to a stop just inches away from Elijah. Groceries spilled onto the street. Apples rolled. A loaf of bread tore through its plastic. Elijah took a step back, more surprised than scared. He looked up at the biker and calmly said, "You could have hit me, son." Trent, still on his bike, stared back at the old man like he was daring him to say more. Then, without warning, he got off. People nearby froze. No one expected what came next. Trent walked up to Elijah, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. The tension was thick. A few folks pulled out their phones, unsure if they should intervene or just record what they were witnessing. And then, it happened. Now, what exactly happened in that moment depends on who you ask. Some say Trent shoved Elijah. Others say there was a heated exchange, with the biker accusing Elijah of stepping out in front of him on purpose. But one thing was clear, the moment turned physical. Elijah stumbled, catching himself on a nearby trash can, but he didn't fall. He stood firm, eyes locked with the much younger man in front of him. The crowd that had started to form was in shock. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was something more. Something raw. But here's where the story takes a turn no one saw coming. A little girl named Maya had been walking her dog across the street with her mother when she saw it all unfold. She was just 9 years old but sharp, and as she tugged on her mother's sleeve, she whispered, "Mom, isn't that Mr. E?" Her mother, now stepping closer to the scene, recognized Elijah instantly. And so did others. One by one, neighbors began stepping forward. A woman in her 50s who used to be one of Elijah's students. A man who remembered when Elijah helped him after his car broke down in the rain. Even the grocery store clerk who had just helped him carry his bags. Voices started rising, not in panic, but in unity. "That's Mr. E," someone shouted. "You can't treat him like that." Trent looked around, suddenly aware that this wasn't just any old man. He had picked the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong town. And yet, he didn't back down. Instead, he smirked. "What, y'all gonna jump me over some old man?" He sneered, looking around as more and more people surrounded them. Elijah, now steady on his feet, looked up at Trent and said something that stopped everyone cold. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't angry. But whatever it was made the biker's face change. His jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened. And for a brief second, it seemed like Trent would lash out again. But before anyone could move, a deep voice called out from the edge of the crowd. "Step away from Mr. Townsend." Heads turned. A tall, broad man in a tailored black suit walked calmly through the crowd. Nobody recognized him at first. He wasn't local. But the way he carried himself, the way his voice commanded attention, it was clear he wasn't just another bystander. Behind him, two other men followed, also in suits. Their expressions were serious. Focused. Trent hesitated. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket slowly, and for a split second, a few people tensed, afraid of what might come next. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a leather badge holder. "You've made a serious mistake today," the man said, now stepping between Trent and Elijah. "And you're about to find out just how serious." Elijah didn't say a word. He just looked at the man in the suit with a strange recognition in his eyes, like he knew something nobody else did. Trent glanced around. The crowd was silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. And the moment stretched, thick with tension, heavy with the weight of something bigger than just an argument at a crosswalk. What had Elijah said that shook the biker so deeply? Who were these men in suits, and why did one of them seem to know him by name? And most importantly, what happened next? That is where this story truly begins. Trent's jaw tightened as he took a step back, not from fear, but from confusion. The presence of the suited men had shifted something in the air. The biker looked from one face to another, trying to figure out what kind of storm he had walked into. He glanced at the badge again, his eyebrows tightening, his fists still clenched like he hadn't fully decided whether to fight or flee. Elijah stood quietly behind the agent, still holding on to the trash can for balance. He hadn't said another word. His bag of groceries lay on the pavement beside him, the apples bruised, the bread dusty from the ground. Yet his calm was striking. It was as if he had seen this kind of moment before and already knew how it would unfold. The man in the black suit leaned closer to Trent. "You have no idea who you just threatened. But you will." The biker laughed nervously. "What, is he some kind of big shot?" He scoffed, trying to sound brave but looking over his shoulder more often now, like he sensed the crowd wasn't on his side anymore. "You could say that," the agent replied coolly. "But not the kind you'd ever hear about on the news." The words made no sense. People in the crowd began whispering. A few older folks looked at Elijah with new eyes, as if trying to place him in a memory they'd long forgotten. Who was Mr. E, really? He had always seemed like a kind man, humble and soft-spoken. A neighborhood grandfather. But now, with federal agents showing up and a biker being warned away from him like he was royalty or something worse, everyone started to wonder. One of the suited men stepped aside and spoke softly into a radio clip to his coat. Whatever he said, it made the other agent's demeanor change just slightly, more alert now. A car pulled up slowly at the corner, dark-tinted windows, government plates. The kind of car you don't just rent from the airport. Meanwhile, Trent was still trying to act tough. "This is crazy," he muttered. "I didn't hit him. He stepped in front of me." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. Maybe deep down, even he knew he was lying. Maybe he'd just assumed Elijah was another old man, someone easy to push past. But now, surrounded by a growing crowd, federal agents, and an air of secrecy thick enough to choke on, his confidence was slipping. The man in the suit turned to Elijah, gently touching his arm. "Sir, we'll take it from here," he said quietly. Elijah looked at him for a long second, then nodded. But his eyes held something deeper. Not fear. Not confusion. But history. Like this wasn't the first time someone had called him, sir, like that. Like the past was starting to catch up in real time. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though many stayed nearby, pretending to check their phones or linger in small conversations, all while glancing back to the scene. The energy had changed. Nobody was yelling anymore. Even Trent didn't have much to say. He just stood there, glancing nervously between Elijah, the agents, and a growing realization that this wasn't going to end with him riding off on his bike. Elijah reached down, slowly picked up his groceries, and with one hand still gripping his cane, began to walk away. But not home. He followed the agents toward the black car, moving slowly, deliberately, like he knew exactly where he was going. The door opened for him without a word. Trent watched, stunned, as Elijah, an 85-year-old man he thought he could intimidate, was being escorted into a government vehicle like he was some kind of national secret. Back at the corner, the air still hung heavy with questions. The woman who had shouted, "That's Mr. E," was still standing there, shaking her head. "I knew he was something special," she whispered to her husband. "Just didn't know how special." For years, Elijah had lived quietly in Greenville. He didn't speak much about his past. He helped neighbors fix broken fences, handed out candy on Halloween, and read stories to kids at the local library on weekends. He was the man who offered his umbrella in the rain and shoveled snow from driveways that weren't his own. But beyond those simple gestures, his life before retirement was mostly a mystery. Some said he had been a teacher. Others thought he worked for the government, maybe the postal service. A few veterans in town knew he had served overseas, but Elijah never spoke about it. Not even during Memorial Day events or town parades. He would salute quietly, tears in his eyes, but never a word about where he'd been or what he'd seen. But now, with federal agents showing up unannounced and treating him like a VIP, or a threat, those silences felt a lot louder. Back in the car, Elijah sat quietly as the agent beside him typed something into a secure tablet. "Sorry about the public scene, sir," the agent finally said. "We didn't expect it to happen like that." Elijah gave a faint smile. "Life never gives you warning. That's the point." The agent looked at him carefully. "They're asking for you, sir. In DC something's come up. It's connected to 83. The words made Elijah's face change. Subtly, but enough for someone paying attention. He looked down at his hands, worn and trembling slightly, but still steady. "So it's starting again," he murmured. The agent didn't answer. He didn't have to. Meanwhile, back in town, Trent had been pulled aside by local police. Not arrested, but definitely detained for questioning. His bike sat idle on the curb. He kept asking the same question over and over: who was that guy? No one had an answer. Not even the officers. The incident was caught on multiple phones, but not a single one of the recordings showed anything beyond the tension. No clear hit. No violence that could be proven. But the footage went viral anyway, not because of the confrontation, but because of what followed. Viewers were captivated by the old man being quietly escorted into a government car. Comments flooded in. People wanted to know, who was Elijah Townsend? One user commented, "I live in Greenville. That's Mr. E. He used to fix kids' bikes for free and tell stories about stars in the sky. This don't make sense." Another replied, "Maybe those stories weren't just stories." The mystery only deepened. News crews began arriving in town. Reporters knocked on doors. Neighbors were suddenly hesitant to say too much, either out of respect or fear. And somewhere far from Greenville, in a room lit only by a computer monitor, a woman watched the video of Elijah stepping into the black car. She froze the screen on his face, leaned closer, and whispered to herself, "He's still alive." The computer screen blinked, and an encrypted message popped up. 2 words, "He's active." But what did that mean? Who was Elijah Townsend really? And what had happened back in 1983 that was about to change everything again? The answers were just beginning to surface. The drive to the airstrip was long and quiet. Elijah sat in the back seat, staring out the window as rows of pine trees blurred past. The agent beside him didn't speak much, only checking his watch and phone occasionally. There was a tension in the car, not from fear, but from something heavier, like both men knew what was coming, but neither wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Every so often, Elijah's fingers tapped lightly on his knee, a small rhythm that hinted at nerves hidden under his calm exterior. Back in Greenville, the town was still buzzing with confusion. The story had spread like wildfire. Some locals defended Trent, saying maybe it had just been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't meant to start anything. Others were furious, especially those who knew Elijah personally. But the real mystery wasn't about the incident anymore. It was about what came after. Why did government agents show up for a retired janitor? Why did they treat him like he was carrying state secrets? At the diner on Main Street, people filled the booths, talking over coffee and eggs. Miss Lorraine, the owner, wiped down the counter while keeping one ear on the chatter. She had known Elijah for 20 years. "He used to sit right there," she said, pointing to a corner booth. "Every Sunday morning. Never asked for much, just black coffee, 2 sugars, and a warm slice of cornbread. You tellin' me that man needed bodyguards?" In another part of town, young Maya sat on her front porch, petting her dog. She couldn't stop thinking about what she saw. Her mom told her not to worry, that Mr. E was fine, but Maya had questions. A lot of them. Why did Mr. E know the men in the suits? Why did that biker look so scared after? And what did he say that made everyone go quiet? Later that day, a man in a dark blue sedan pulled into the edge of town. He didn't wear a suit, and he didn't have government plates. But he had a quiet intensity that turned heads. He asked no questions, but stopped by the local library, the grocery store, and the post office. At each place, he said only one thing: Elijah Townsend. "What can you tell me about him?" Most people gave short, polite answers. A few asked who the man was. He never gave a name. Just nodded and moved on. But he was writing things down. Every word. Every detail. At the airstrip, Elijah stepped out of the car slowly. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of jet fuel and pine needles. A small private jet waited at the far end of the tarmac. The agent stayed close, not out of necessity, but out of habit. Elijah didn't need protection. He needed answers, same as everyone else. As they boarded, the agent finally broke the silence. "You know, sir, after all these years, I didn't think you'd ever be called in again." Elijah gave a tired smile. "Neither did I." "Why now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the small window as the engines roared to life. Far from Greenville, in a government building with no signs and a security system built for war, a panel of 3 people sat in a dimly lit room. They wore no uniforms, but everything about them said power. One of them, a woman with gray hair and piercing eyes, tapped a finger on a file in front of her. Elijah Townsend. Codename, Sparrow. Thought to be inactive since 1983. "No communications, no operations, nothing," she said. The man beside her raised an eyebrow. "He surfaced because of a street fight." The third one, younger, leaned forward. "It wasn't random. We believe someone flushed him out." "That biker? He may have just been a distraction." The room fell silent. Back on the jet, Elijah opened his wallet and pulled out an old, faded photo. It showed a group of 5 men in uniform, some smiling, some serious. He ran his thumb over the image, stopping at one face in the middle. The man had the same eyes as the agent sitting across from him. "You look like your father," Elijah said quietly. The agent looked up, surprised. "You knew him?" "We were brothers," Elijah replied. "Not by blood. By survival." The agent sat back, unsure what to say. That single sentence had pulled him into something deeper than his training had ever prepared him for. In Greenville, Trent sat in a holding cell at the county station, bouncing his knee and muttering to himself. He had finally been booked for disturbing the peace. Nothing major. But what really messed with his head wasn't the charge, it was that man's face. Elijah's calmness. His stillness. And the way those agents acted like he was someone who could end wars with a word. "Who is he?" Trent asked the officer on duty. The officer shrugged. "All I know is you messed with the wrong man." Trent leaned back against the wall, rubbing his temples. "They're not gonna let this go, are they?" "Nope." Meanwhile, that same man in the dark sedan drove back out of town and made a call from the roadside. "He's more protected than we thought," he said into the phone. "But I saw the way people looked at him. He's still connected. They'll listen to him." The voice on the other end was gravelly. "Does he know we're coming?" "Not yet. But he will." And then the call ended. Back on the jet, Elijah finally spoke again. "If they're coming back, they're not coming for me. They're coming for what we buried." The agent looked confused. "What do you mean?" Elijah turned his eyes from the window. "There's a reason I stayed quiet all these years. A reason we erased our names. We didn't just walk away from the work, we buried the truth. And if they're trying to bring it back..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. As the plane crossed into restricted airspace, the truth hovered like a storm cloud ready to burst. Elijah Townsend wasn't just a man with a quiet past. He was a man holding back a dangerous one. And now, the past was waking up. And in Greenville, people would soon learn that the quietest man in their town had been carrying the loudest secret of all. The jet touched down just after midnight, on a runway so remote it didn't even show up on public satellite maps. Fog clung low to the ground, as if trying to hide what was waiting beyond the landing lights. Elijah stepped out slowly, his cane sinking into the damp gravel. He looked around, not with fear, but with recognition, like he'd walked this very ground before, only under much different circumstances. A black SUV was already waiting at the end of the tarmac. The door opened and a man stepped out, tall, sharp suit, silver cufflinks, and a look in his eyes like he knew things no one else should. Elijah studied him for a long second. "Didn't expect you," he said quietly. The man offered a thin smile. "You were never good at predicting the end." They didn't shake hands. Instead, the man turned and nodded toward the vehicle. "They're waiting. And time's short." Elijah nodded and followed, his steps slower but steady. Inside the vehicle, a large black folder sat on the seat beside him. He didn't open it yet. He didn't need to. Whatever was inside wasn't new, it was unfinished. Back in Greenville, the temperature had dropped. People locked their doors early that night, sensing something they couldn't name. At the edge of town, near the abandoned rail yard, the man in the blue sedan returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two others followed him, quiet, dressed in plain clothes, but moved like soldiers. They set up in a dark corner of the yard, watching, waiting. One pulled out a small scanner and swept the area. "He used to meet here," the leader muttered. "Back in the cold days." Another nodded. "You think he left anything behind?" "No," the man said. "But someone else might have." At the same time, Maya couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Mr. E. About the day at the store. About how he stood still while the biker shouted. And how calm he was when those agents arrived. He didn't flinch. He didn't fight. He just waited. Like he'd been through worse. She climbed out of bed and walked to the bookshelf where she kept a small wooden box Elijah had once given her. Inside was a collection of old coins, a pocket compass, and a folded note. She'd never opened it. Her mother had told her it was probably just a birthday message or something simple. But tonight, curiosity won. She unfolded the paper carefully. It was yellow with age, the ink slightly faded. For words were written in Elijah's steady handwriting. "When they return, run." Her breath caught. What did that mean? She read it again and again until her hands started to shake. Far away, inside a concrete building with no windows and walls thicker than vault doors, Elijah sat across from the panel again. The same three people as before, only this time their faces were even more tense. "We found movement near the Zurich signal site," the woman said. "Same frequency we used in '83. Elijah nodded. "They're waking it up. We thought it was buried." "They did too," he replied. "But they're not looking for it now. They're looking for me." The younger man leaned forward. "What happens if they find you first?" Elijah looked up, his voice calm. "Then the world remembers why we buried the truth in the first place." There was silence for a long moment. Then the woman stood. "We need to activate contingency." Elijah shook his head. "That'll put Greenville on the map. You really want to bring this to innocent people's front yards?" "We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do," Elijah said. "But you're going to have to trust me again." She hesitated, then sat back down. Trust. It had been the breaking point last time. Meanwhile, Trent had been released. He wandered back to the edge of town, trying to piece together what had happened. What kind of man had he messed with? The videos had been scrubbed off the internet fast, too fast. People talked, but nobody had answers. Only rumors. Some said Elijah used to work for a secret agency. Others claimed he was part of some Cold War project that never made the news. But Trent knew one thing for sure, whatever he'd gotten involved in, it wasn't over. That night, the air over Greenville changed again. A blackout swept through part of the town, not just a power outage, but a total shutdown. Phones went dead. Internet connections dropped. It was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. And at that exact moment, the man in the blue sedan made his move. He approached Elijah's old house. The porch light was off. Curtains drawn. But the door was unlocked. Inside, he found nothing, no furniture, no clothes, no trace of recent living. Except for one thing. On the wall near the kitchen, scratched faintly into the paint, were 3 numbers, July 4th, 83. He stared at them, his expression unreadable. He remembers, he whispered. In a surveillance van parked 2 blocks away, a tech analyst typed those numbers into a decryption tool. A moment later, a map appeared. Not of the US. Not even of North America. It showed a small island off the coast of Norway. The analyst turned to his superior. He marked the original location. Then he's not hiding, the man said. He's preparing. Back at the facility, Elijah stood in front of a locked metal door. Behind it were items that hadn't seen daylight in decades, files, devices, names. And secrets. He placed his hand on the scanner, and the door clicked open. Inside was a long hallway with a vault at the end. As he walked forward, memories hit him like waves. Missions that had never made it to headlines. Names that were changed, erased, or buried. And a promise he had made to a dying friend, to never let it happen again. But now, it was happening. The agent from the plane followed close behind, clearly unsettled. "Sir, we need to know. What's behind that door?" Elijah stopped at the vault and turned slowly. The last piece of what we tried to forget. He typed in a code. The vault hissed. And just before the door opened, the lights above them flickered. A warning. Someone else had accessed the grid. They weren't alone anymore. And somewhere, in another country, a phone buzzed in a dark room. A voice on the other end said just 3 words. "It's him. Move." The storm was no longer coming. It had already begun. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a room frozen in time. Thick dust blanketed every surface, and a soft red light blinked on the far wall, steady and slow, like a heartbeat that never stopped. Elijah stepped in, his face unreadable. The agent behind him paused, sensing something more than just classified files or forgotten tech. There was a weight in the air, a presence that didn't belong to the room alone. In the center stood a metal case, long and sealed with biometric locks. Elijah walked to it without hesitation, kneeling beside it with surprising ease for a man his age. He placed his hand on the scanner, and after a tense pause, the lock hissed open. Inside was not a weapon, nor documents, but a small black notebook with frayed edges and a symbol etched into the cover, a symbol the agent didn't recognize. Elijah looked at it for a moment before tucking it into his coat. "You ever hear of Operation Night Chapel?" Elijah asked. The agent shook his head. Wasn't in the debrief files. It wouldn't be, Elijah said quietly. Because it was never meant to be remembered. He turned back toward the vault's entrance, but just as he stepped out, the red light on the wall changed, blinking faster now. A sharp alarm buzzed once, then stopped. The agent instinctively reached for his earpiece. Static. Total blackout. They're already inside the perimeter, Elijah muttered. Somewhere far above them, inside the security monitoring room, a second alert flashed on screen. The facility's exterior cameras cut out one by one, first at the gate, then along the east wall, then the roof. A technician scrambled for manual override, but the system froze with a single message across the screen. Access granted, July 4, '83. Someone had used Elijah's old authorization code. Someone who wasn't supposed to have it. Meanwhile, back in Greenville, Maya stood outside the diner, clutching the note Elijah had written years ago. Her mother had found her reading it under the porch light and tried to take it away, but Maya had insisted. Something about the tone in Elijah's writing didn't feel like a warning, it felt like a countdown. That night, Miss Lorraine closed the diner early. She'd received a phone call on the landline, something that hadn't rung in years. The voice on the other end had said only, "Get out. Tonight. Don't ask questions." She didn't. She packed up the register, handed Maya's mother a to-go bag of cornbread and chicken, and whispered, "Whatever Elijah was running from, it's found him. And it might find us too." But it wasn't just finding Elijah. It was following the traces he left behind. 1,000 miles away, in a clean office building under a fake tech startup, a young analyst was reviewing archival footage from the 1980s. He'd been tasked with looking into the original files of Operation Night Chapel, just to double-check any loose ends. But what he found was something no one expected. Elijah hadn't buried the truth alone. There were 4 others. Operatives. Friends. 1 presumed dead, 2 off the grid, and 1 still active. Under a new name. With a high-level clearance. The analyst's hand trembled as he printed the file. The photograph stared back at him, an older man in a military uniform, currently stationed at an Arctic base. The analyst circled the name and picked up the phone. But before he could dial, the lights in his office flickered. And then went out. Elijah, now deep inside the underground vault, suddenly stopped. His fingers pressed against his coat pocket, feeling the notebook. The agent beside him noticed. "What's in there?" he asked again. Elijah stared at him for a long time. Then he spoke slowly, like dragging the truth from a place he never wanted to revisit. "It's not just what we did, it's what we brought back. The project was never about defense, it was about control. Ideas. Thought manipulation. You ever hear of the whisper algorithm?" The agent frowned. "That's a conspiracy theory." Elijah shook his head. "No. It was real. And we were part of it." Back in town, Maya's mother noticed black SUVs parked across from the school. Not moving. Just watching. She clutched Maya's hand tightly and turned them back toward the house. But the men inside those vehicles weren't interested in the school, they were waiting for a signal. One that would come as soon as Elijah made his next move. Inside the facility, the door behind Elijah slammed shut. The red lights turned solid. And then, a voice came over the intercom, raspy, familiar. "Townsend, you should have stayed buried." Elijah's breath caught. The agent looked at him. "Who is that?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. "The ghost we never caught." The voice laughed. "You thought night chapel ended because you shut the doors. But we learned how to open others." Then silence. The agent drew his sidearm instinctively, but Elijah stayed calm. "Put that away. If he's here, bullets won't stop him." Suddenly, from the far end of the corridor, a panel slid open. A narrow hallway beyond glowed with white light. Elijah didn't hesitate, he stepped into the light, the notebook tight in his hand. "They're not after me anymore," he said over his shoulder. "They're after what's left of the chapel." And then he disappeared into the corridor, leaving the agent torn between orders and instinct. Above ground, in the darkened surveillance van, one of the operatives watching Greenville received a secure transmission. A voice said, "He opened the vault. Do not engage until target reaches stage 3. The operative replied, "And what if the girl, Maya, is exposed?" The voice paused, then replied coldly, "Collateral." But Maya wasn't where they thought she was. With the note clutched in her hand, she had quietly slipped away. Something deep in her gut told her she wasn't just a witness. She was part of something Elijah had planned long before she was old enough to understand it. She followed a trail, a route he'd once walked her through as a game, past the old greenhouse, across the train tracks, and into the woods behind the high school. There, hidden beneath the roots of an ancient oak, she found what she didn't know she was looking for. A second notebook. Smaller. Labeled, Maya. For when it begins. The first page read only, "You'll need to trust your memory more than your eyes." The story was no longer just about Elijah. It was about who would carry on what he couldn't finish. And in the shadows, others were watching. Waiting. Because the real war wasn't on a battlefield. It was in the minds of those who thought it had already ended. The woods were quiet except for Maya's footsteps, crunching softly over leaves and twigs. She moved carefully, clutching the notebook Elijah had left for her. Her hands trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the overwhelming sense that something was coming to an end, and she was no longer a bystander. Inside the pages were names, dates, and instructions. Most of it didn't make sense yet. But one line was underlined 3 times, "When the frequency hits, you'll hear the static. That's your moment." At that exact moment, deep underground, Elijah stepped into the circular chamber at the end of the corridor. The walls were lined with strange machines, pulsing with a low hum. In the center stood a tall structure, metallic, like a narrow tower, surrounded by faint blue light. He hadn't seen it in 40 years, and still it pulsed the same way it had that night in 1983. The voice from earlier echoed again, this time from the shadows. "You kept the key all this time. Even after the others walked away." Elijah didn't turn. They didn't walk. They were forced to. From the far side of the room, a figure stepped into the light. Dressed in a civilian suit, older but unmistakable, Colonel Briggs. One of the original Night Chapel founders. He had disappeared decades ago. Everyone believed he was dead. But here he was, alive, and clearly in control of whatever was still running beneath the surface. "I saw what this could be," Briggs said, walking closer. "Thought influence. Emotional override. Not war, Elijah. Peace. A world without chaos." Elijah turned slowly now, his eyes locked on the man who had once been like a brother to him. "You built a machine that takes away choice. That's not peace. That's silence." Briggs smiled, tired but unwavering. Silence is how we survive. Behind him, the machine hummed louder. A low static buzz began building. Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out the black notebook, the original. He held it like a weapon, but not in anger. In remembrance. "This book has the shutdown sequence," he said. "And I'm the last one who knows it." Briggs frowned, stepping forward. "You won't use it." "You're right," Elijah said softly. "She will." Outside the facility, Maya stood at the edge of the tree line. The strange humming had reached her ears, a faint sound she couldn't explain, like electricity in the air. She opened her notebook again and saw the signal frequencies scrawled in Elijah's handwriting. She turned the last page and found a simple drawing, the same tower Elijah now stood before. Below it, instructions. At that moment, a panel of leaves shifted beside her, and one of the operatives from the black SUV stepped out, his weapon drawn but low. "You don't want to be here, kid." She didn't run. "My name's Maya," she said. "And if you don't stop this, none of us will have a choice left." The man hesitated. Something in her voice made him pause. His earpiece crackled, then died in a burst of static. Inside the chamber, Elijah placed the notebook on the console at the base of the tower. He looked up at Briggs. "You always said people weren't ready for the truth. But the truth doesn't wait. It catches up." Briggs's expression hardened. "You won't make it out of here." Elijah gave a faint smile. "I already have." And then, from the surface, Maya followed the last instruction. She closed her eyes, pressed both hands to the rough bark of the oak tree, and spoke the phrase Elijah had taught her when she was small, a nonsense rhyme he'd repeated during walks: "Static finds the silence. Silence finds the song." The tree pulsed beneath her fingers. Below ground, the tower reacted instantly. The blue light flickered. Then glowed red. "What did you do?" Briggs shouted. Elijah stepped back. "I didn't build the failsafe." And for the first time, fear appeared in Briggs's eyes. "I did," came another voice. From the far tunnel, the agent who had followed Elijah into the facility returned, dragging a bloodied figure behind him, one of Briggs's guards. The agent's hands were shaking, but he held his ground. "I figured out who you were," he said to Briggs. "And what this place is. I'm not with you." Briggs reached for the console, trying to override the system. But Elijah opened his notebook and read the final line aloud. "Shutdown requires 2 echoes." The lights around the chamber began to dim. The machine groaned, then sputtered. Maya's hands lifted from the tree. All around her, the woods buzzed, then silenced. The power grid in Greenville surged, then stabilized. Phones buzzed back to life. The surveillance van outside the school went dark. Inside the chamber, the tower began to collapse inward, not explosively, but like it was folding back into itself. Briggs backed away, shouting, but his words were lost under the growing whine of the reversal sequence. And in the center of the storm, Elijah stood still. Calm. Watching it end. The agent reached for him. "We have to go." But Elijah shook his head. "No. Someone has to stay and lock the door behind us." The agent froze, unsure. "But you." Elijah handed him the black notebook. "She's ready. Just make sure they know why we stopped it." The agent stared at him for a moment, then turned and ran. At the surface, Maya stood waiting as the earth gave a final, low rumble beneath her feet. And then, nothing. Silence. 2 days later, the news quietly reported an unexpected earthquake beneath an abandoned military testing ground. No casualties. No explanations. Maya sat at the diner again, notebook open. She'd read it 3 times now, and each time it made more sense. Names. Codes. Locations. But one line at the end, in Elijah's neat handwriting, was new. The whisper is gone. But someone will try again. You'll know what to do. Just as she closed the cover, the diner door opened. A man stepped inside, a face she didn't know. But he walked with the same quiet presence Elijah once had. He slid a small envelope onto the table and nodded. Inside was a single photo, Elijah, years ago, standing in front of a satellite dish, with 4 others beside him. But in the background was someone she didn't expect to see at all. Miss Lorraine. Smiling. Not old. Not weak. But wearing a uniform. And in her hand, a notebook. The story wasn't over. It had just begun. Maya stared at the photo for a long time, her mind racing. The picture was old, grainy, but unmistakable. Miss Lorraine, the kind-hearted woman who'd been like a second mother to her, was standing right beside Elijah, smiling. And she was holding a notebook, one that looked just like the one Maya had kept tucked away. The realization hit her like a wave. All this time, Miss Lorraine had known. She wasn't just the diner owner who made the best fried chicken in Greenville. She was part of this story, part of a legacy that stretched far beyond the town's sleepy streets. Maya's hand shook as she folded the photo and slid it into her pocket. She didn't know what to do with the information yet, but she couldn't ignore the truth. She had to find out what Miss Lorraine had been involved in, and why she had kept it hidden. What was the connection between the town, Elijah, and this secret organization that had operated in the shadows for decades? The man who had handed her the envelope. The one who looked like Elijah but was younger, watched her closely. He hadn't said a word since he walked in, just left the envelope on the table and gave her that look. The kind of look that spoke volumes without saying anything at all. He wasn't going to push her to act, but she knew he was waiting. Waiting for her to make the next move. Maya tucked the photo away, standing up. "Where can I find her?" she asked, her voice steady but urgent. The man paused, then nodded towards the back door of the diner. "She'll be waiting for you." Maya didn't hesitate. She stepped past him and toward the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. As she opened the door, the cool night air hit her face, and she stepped into the alley behind the diner. It was dark, but there was a faint light coming from the small shed at the back of the lot. She walked toward it, each step heavy with the weight of everything she had just learned. When she reached the shed, the door creaked open, and there stood Miss Lorraine. But she wasn't the same woman Maya had known. Her face was older, yes, but her eyes were sharper, focused. She wasn't the soft, comforting woman who served pancakes with a smile. This woman was someone different, someone with a purpose. Someone who had seen things, done things that Maya couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Come in, Maya," Miss Lorraine said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. Maya stepped into the dimly lit room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The shed was far larger than it appeared from the outside, filled with old maps, books, and a variety of equipment she couldn't quite place. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding various objects, some mundane, others far more unusual. There were also photographs, pinned up in a haphazard fashion, with lines and notes connecting them. The same symbol from Elijah's notebook appeared in several places. "Maya," Miss Lorraine began, her voice calm but firm, "there's a lot you don't know. About me, about Elijah, about what we were trying to do." "I don't understand," Maya said, her voice shaking slightly. "You were involved in all of this? In what Elijah did? I thought you were just—" "I don't know, a diner owner." Miss Lorraine smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I guess that's what you'd call my cover. But I was never just a diner owner. I was part of something bigger. Something that started with Elijah and his team all those years ago." Maya felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What is it? What is it that you've all been doing?" Miss Lorraine walked over to a nearby table, picking up a thick folder and placing it in front of Maya. "It's not what you think. We didn't start this war, Maya. But we couldn't let it happen either. The Whisper algorithm, the project that Elijah and I were both a part of, it was supposed to be a tool. A tool for peace. But people can't control things like that. When you start manipulating minds, you don't get to choose who it affects. We tried to shut it down, but as you saw, it wasn't that simple." Maya opened the folder, her eyes scanning the papers inside. Diagrams, calculations, dates, all pointing to one thing: Operation Night Chapel had been a much larger operation than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about the machines, the algorithms, or the control of minds. It was about the people who would stop at nothing to keep the system alive. "It's still happening, isn't it?" Maya asked quietly, her voice a whisper. Miss Lorraine nodded. "The system didn't die when we shut down the main facility. It was too deeply embedded in the world. But we've been watching it. Waiting for the right moment." "And now?" Maya asked, feeling the weight of everything Miss Lorraine was saying. "What do we do now?" "We fight," Miss Lorraine said simply, but there was no hesitation in her words. "It's not over, Maya. It never was. The people behind it all are still out there. They've been watching you too. They knew you'd come looking for answers. And now, you have a choice." Maya's mind raced. She thought of Elijah, the man who had tried to protect her, who had sacrificed so much to stop this. She thought of the people who had been manipulated by this system, and all the lives that had been affected. The war wasn't over. It had just shifted, and now, it was her turn to make a difference. "What's my choice?" Maya asked, her voice steady now. "Take what Elijah started," Miss Lorraine said, "and finish it. You're the one who can shut it down for good. But you'll have to be prepared. They won't stop until they have what they want." Maya nodded. She didn't know if she was ready for what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't walk away. This was her fight now. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying the sound of distant sirens. The world hadn't stopped moving, and neither could she. Maya looked at Miss Lorraine, the woman who had been her guide through this twisted journey, and knew that the path ahead would be anything but easy. But it was a path she had to walk. With a final glance at the shed, Maya stepped out into the night, her resolve firm. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. And no matter the cost, she was ready to finish what Elijah had started. She wasn't just the girl from the diner anymore. She was part of something bigger now. A legacy. A promise. And she would make sure that the Whisper algorithm, and everything it stood for, was buried for good.